Salams from the People's Dispatch studios in New Delhi. I'm Siddhantani. You're watching Daily Debrief. On the show today, we continue our build-up to the NATO summit that's coming up in Madrid. We're talking about Russia's supposed bond default and an important step forward for international workers' rights. First up, firing on the afterburners of the G7 summit, NATO meets in Madrid to deliberate on its first new strategic concept in about a decade. Most of the attention, of course, will be focusing on Russia and the ongoing war in Europe. We already know that the military organization plans a seven-fold increase in what it will term as a rapid response force to as many as 300,000 personnel. We can be pretty sure also that NATO will, for the first time, cite China as a concern, although there are differences within the ranks, with some member nations not looking at China as a military adversary. US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, though, told reporters on the sidelines of the G7 summit in Germany that NATO's strategy paper would, and I quote now, speak in ways that are unprecedented about the challenge that China poses, end quote. Prashant is in studio to talk more about all of these issues. Prashant, first up, how do we see the summit in the context of the ongoing conflict in Ukraine?
Right. So this was, the war, the Russia-Ukraine war has sort of revitalized NATO. It's no doubt about that, because there was a moment last year, especially after Afghanistan, when it seemed completely in tatters. Even key NATO countries were having major disagreements among each other. A lot of these cracks seem to have been sort of papered a bit, to some extent, by, at least in the short run, by the Russian attack on Ukraine. And what has emerged is this belligerent sort of militarism that has characterized all the responses. We know you talked about the 300,000 strong force. There's been an increase in supplies by all NATO member countries. So one key element is definitely going to be the pressure to make sure that all these countries commit 2% of their defense budget for defense purposes, which is going to mean a large amount of militarization in the world, a considerable increase. And we already know that the United States is increasing its budget every year. Germany has committed to the same. And if all the NATO members do so, that could mean quite a drastic, increase in military spending across the world, which is really definitely not good for anybody. In a large way, it actually, in some senses, almost justifies or say completely vindicates Russia, is a better word probably, which kept saying that NATO expansionism was really the problem, was the root cause of the war. And NATO members have also again sort of doubled down on that, reconfirmed that. We also know the question of Finland and Sweden wanting to join NATO also very much on the cards. Turkey is opposing it. Turkey seeking its own concessions from the US as far as its internal politics is concerned. So a lot of things on the agenda as far as Europe is concerned. Like I said, the most unfortunate thing we're probably going to see is a further commitment to militarization. And they might say all these big words and nice sounding concepts like democracy, freedom, etc. But this is essentially a major boon to the military-industrial complex. It's going to be a major increase in tensions in Europe, and the way they're sort of working, it looks like it's going to be a major increase in tensions across the globe as well, which we'll come to next. But that seems more or less broadly what's on the cards, unfortunately, in the next 2 days.
So yeah, with the indications that we have from reports from both NATO diplomats as well as US sources, China is going to be for the first time mentioned in a NATO strategic paper. How does that make it sort of a more global thing from what was once restricted to at least Europe?
Right, so it's arguable if it was ever restricted to Europe, especially over the past 20 years. We've seen NATO in Libya, we've seen NATO in Afghanistan, for instance, and nowhere close to Europe. Yeah. But focusing on China is going to definitely be another major sort of milestone, so to speak, for NATO, because it truly marks its evolution into a full-fledged global force, because there is really no conflict that any of these NATO countries per se have with China. Even the United States is basically sort of trying to encircle China for no other reason except the fact that it is incapable of dealing with China's economic growth. So what we are clear, and we know that the US, the UK, AUKUS has been established, the Quad has been established. We know that Japan and South Korea, leaders are attending the NATO summit. Again, a very, very dangerous, escalation as far as this is concerned, because there is absolutely no logical reason for NATO to expand into the east, into the Asia-Pacific region. There's utterly no logic at all. So NATO sort of assuming for itself this role of some kind of global police force is extremely problematic. It is, really pushing things to a tipping point. The strategy again and again seems to be to push countries to a position where they have no option but to respond forcefully as well. And we saw pretty much that is actually what kind of happened with Russia and Ukraine as well, because there were easy ways of de-escalating this. Incidentally, Volodymyr Zelensky now says that we know that we won't be able to enter NATO. And this is what the European countries also said. This is what everyone said. But nonetheless, the NATO countries refused to give a commitment which could have solved half the problems between Russia and Ukraine. But that pretty much, this is pretty much going to be probably a model for NATO actions across the world. And this does not really bode well at all for global peace. We know that there is a massive climate crisis that we're going to face as a planet. We're facing inflation, we're facing hunger, we're facing all kinds of shortages and problems. And in the middle of it, that these North Atlantic powers sort of, enter into the scene with this kind of militaristic approach is really nothing, is a very dangerous precedent.
Yeah. As we were talking yesterday also, G7 summit, we were thinking we'd hear things about the economy with the biggest industrialized nations, but instead we heard a whole lot about a military package.
Absolutely.
So yeah, that seems to be the direction. Thanks very much for that update, Prashant. We're continuing to talk about Russia a little bit now, but now from a more financial perspective. You might have seen several headlines on some of the leading Western financial publications talking about Russia's current inability to pay back some of its bond investors. The Kremlin has, of course, rejected the claim outright, saying that Russia is not in default. Dmitry Peskov, the spokesperson for the Kremlin, told a press conference just today that Russia has made all the bond payments that were due in May, but they've been blocked because of Western sanctions, essentially saying that this is an enforced default. NewsClick Editor-in-Chief Prabir Purkayastha spoke with me earlier to clear up some of the fog in this narrative. Prabir, good to have you on Daily Debrief. We've been reading all the headlines about Russia's historic default. What is the economics of this? What does it actually mean?
Well, there are three sets of issues over here. One is, what is a bond? And I think for most people, it's not even clear that the bond itself is something which is an instrument, financial instrument. What does it really mean? Well, it is for sovereign states or for private entities, if they're big enough. They can say, I'm releasing bonds in the market. You buy the bonds. Governments, of course, do sell bonds. That is part of how they raise finances. And I will pay you interest plus a return on the bonds. Plus, I'll give you back the original also over a period of years. And normally, bonds can be long-term. If you're a sovereign state, it can be 10, 20, 30-year bonds. Because the understanding is states don't default. Very few states will default. And of course, defaults are not unknown to happen for states as well. But most large states don't default. And Russia, as you know, the last time it defaulted was in 1918 during the Bolshevik Revolution. That's the earlier default that is there. Sometimes defaults have taken place temporarily. They have been bailed out. Things have been sorted out. What is called bondholders take a haircut. That means forego some of their interest payments and so on. So all of this is the normal process of how bonds can sometimes get into problems, because the sovereign states get into problems with like Sri Lanka, for instance, right now, could have payment problems with bonds as well, because of the hierarchy of things that states have to pay for. The bonds come lower down. But default of a bond means that you cannot raise finances in the international market for maybe a foreseeable future. So that's why those who issue bonds are quite careful not to have the default take place. In this case, of course, the bonds are Euro bonds, and there's a $100 million repayment which was scheduled. Russia obviously has a lot of foreign exchange at the moment. It's selling both gas and oil, selling it to even the European Union. As you know, it's making more money than before the sanctions. The prices have gone up by gas by I think 3 or 4 times, oil almost 2 times. And unfortunately for the European Union, they did not have a fixed price contract, which actually Russians wanted for gas. And then, of course, they're faced with the fact that the prices internationally are going up. And therefore, Russia is making what they all are very unhappy with, a killing on the fact that they have been sanctioned. So sanctions has driven up the price and they have made more money. So the recent attempt is to bring their credit rating down by saying you cannot pay us because all the avenues of payment that you have, we have thrown you out of that. We have taken away all the foreign exchange you had in European banks and in the US banks. You can't pay out of that. That you no longer have access to. But even your banks, even if you want to pay us in dollars or in euros, you can't pay us, because that we're not allowing you. We have stopped all the SWIFT payments. So this is enforced default, meaning the default is what has been engineered. Well, Russia has the money. They say, we can't, you have the money, okay, that's fine, but we will not let you pay it. And then we'll declare you a defaulter. Now, that seems to be, a very, what shall we say, it's a very artificial game to talk this as a default. In the meanwhile, right after the sanctions were imposed, Eurobonds have crashed and their prices went down by 80%. So to the bondholders, this is no longer an issue, because they believe that they have lost most of the value of the bond. Now people who buy these bonds buy it on the iffy chance that they can sue the government. In fact, that's how the bonds in Argentina were taken by some of the venture funds, who then sued Argentina in US court and then got judgment saying that they have to pay X amount, or maybe the Argentinian embassy would be seized in lieu of not paying. So all of these things are really what are the shenanigans of finance capital in the West, in the United States, using American law and American rules, so to say, to dictate to the rest. But in terms of what is the real issue is, do the sovereign states have the right to pay the money that they own, they have, to bondholders if, for instance, the US government and the European Union decides, no, we won't let them pay. Then what happens? This, I think, is completely uncharted territory at the moment. So this is what is really an engineered default, not because Russia is not paying or doesn't have the money, but those who have to accept the money, we will not accept your money and say that this is a default. And therefore, this, if it becomes a default like this, then it's possible the bondholders or those who buy this now defaulted bonds at a penny to the dollar, then they can go to the US court and say, hey, $300 billion of money is there in European banks and American banks. So we should be allowed to take money out from that, and we should be able to then compensate ourselves by this, with this money. So I think those are the kind of shenanigans now in progress, by which how the money that they have seized can legally be then claimed to be taken over. I think those are the appropriation. This, I think, is the name of the game at the moment. And of course, this big hoo-ha in the papers, oh, Russia has defaulted, my God, their economy must be really going down the chute. And nobody actually reading beyond the headlines, because nobody understands the bond market, what does this mean, and so on. So take it for granted, the first one paragraph, 2 paragraphs, Russia has gone down the tube. That I think is the public intent at the moment. Long term, we'll have to see.
Very much in line with the sort of anti-Russia rhetoric and sort of pro-war rhetoric that's been drummed up in the Western media anyway, Prabir. So when we are talking about sort of the Kremlin has, for its part, come out and said that essentially this is not our problem. Like you pointed out, we have made the payments that were due to be made. If you don't accept the payments, that's something that you kind of have to sort out. So where do we go from here in terms of either these payments or the wider, like you were mentioning, precedents it sets for how international financial or capital works?
Well, international finance capital at the moment is in a bit of a crisis, because having created the sanctions regime, they seem to have sanctioned themselves in the price of oil and gas going up. Now, Germany has said, and also the European Union, that we will use more of coal. Now, they are the ones who were, remember, just a few months back, they were once, say, telling India and China, you use dirty coal. Irrespective of what happens to your economy, we don't care. You have to get off coal now. We might have used it for the last 100, 200 years, but that's okay, that we didn't know. But now you have to get off it. Now faced with the problem that they don't have gas or oil, or the prices are too high, Germany is saying we'll restart mothballed coal plants. So all of this also shows up the hypocrisy of the European Union. And this is, I think, the problem the European Union has, that it wants to hunt with the hound, but also run with the hare when it needs oil and gas. And I think also coal. So I think the European Union has really put itself in a completely, not, I would not say straitjacket, they've really put themselves in a vice that they are, the more the sanction, the more they are squeezed. And they don't seem to know how to get out of it except raising the pitch higher. And at some point, all of this has to, the reality, they have to beat reality. So I think that's what they still lack, that they still are not accepting the reality. The United States combined, do not rule the world anymore. And the days of colonialism is long past. And the days of neocolonialism had a very short lifespan. Post-Soviet Union fall is about 30 years. So I think they're still to accept that reality, that things are changing, and therefore they cannot dictate to the world. And for countries who hold primary resources like oil, coal, gas, metals, food. So I think those things are now have to be sorted out. It's an international finance that has to be sorted out in the background of course, the Ukraine war.
And finally, at the recently held International Labour Organization conference, delegates voted to add the principle of a safe and healthy working environment to the ILO's fundamental principles and rights at work. That's essentially the Bill of Rights for workers around the world. Labour activists are calling it the biggest moment for workers' rights in 25 years. The resolution means governments must now commit to respect and promote the right to a safe and healthy working environment. Anna Rashad of People's Health Dispatches spoke with me earlier about how this landmark UN decision will actually affect employees. Anna, as always, good to have you on Daily Debrief, and today we're talking about at least a story that has some positive ramifications. Can you tell us first what the context is in which this resolution was adopted, and why is it so vital to have both policy as well as action on occupational safety and health?
Right. So basically what has happened was that in mid-June, the International Labour Organization decided to expand the basic pillar of workers' rights by adding occupational safety and health to the list of basic rights. So essentially, this means that country members of the ILO will be required to uphold occupational safety and health rights, just like until then they were required to protect, and they still are, of course, required to protect the right of workers to associate, that is, to join trade unions, to do collective bargaining, but also to prevent child and forced labor and prevent discrimination in employment. So, of course, we do unfortunately see from the previous four pillars that the ILO adopting a decision like this does not lead to immediate action. So, we're not going to see instant reaction to what the ILO has done. But it's still important to have this recognized as a problematic field and a field that needs more intervention by the governments. It's also important, I think, that because of the recent context that we have experienced during the pandemic, and that is basically that occupational safety and health has not really been recognized as something very important. It has been quite low on the list of priorities. And when we're talking about COVID-19, it has essentially led to widespread infection and to death of both health workers and other essential workers, because they did not have access to the adequate protection in the workplace, including personal protective equipment. So, but it's also not all about the pandemic, of course. We do also know from before that the state of affairs in this field has been so bad that it has led to deaths of 1,000 workers at times, when textile factories collapsed, when people who are working in construction sites, also related to quite high-profile events like the World Football Cup, have died because of the bad working conditions that they were forced to work in. And finally, of course, this has very strong implications for workers, for informal workers, for migrant workers, who most often do not have the same level of protection and cannot access the same mechanisms of protection that the workers who are formally employed sometimes can.
So now that sort of it's been accepted, what action is immediately required to make a sort of most vital intervention in terms of the working conditions for employees?
Well, let's start with the need of governments to step up and actually start implementing and relying on this decision by the ILO. So, as I mentioned before, we are unlikely to see much progress in case the governments are not ready to back the content of this decision. And so, it depends on various things. So it depends on the scope or the width in which we basically see occupational safety and health. We have to take into consideration quite a wide range of factors, including climate change. So in the places where it's summer now, we are seeing a lot of advice by public health institutions and officials being circulated on how people can protect themselves from the heat and from the effects of heat waves. But on the other hand, we see very, very little talk about how workers who are forced to work in these conditions and who are not allowed to, spend 8 hours a day in air-conditioned spaces. So how can they be protected, and what do we need to protect those workers? And of course, this depends a lot on what kind of policy surrounds the working conditions and who is prioritized in these policies and actions. While the governments remain partial to employers, as unfortunately it's still the case in many, many places, the impacts of such decisions are going to be limited. So, it's also important to think that about occupational safety and health, that it's not only about the illnesses that arise in the workplace, but it's also about the responsibility and who bears the responsibility for those illnesses arising. It shouldn't be the workers. The workers are not to blame because they are forced to work in such workplaces. But the employers do have the tools to make that better, and they often choose not to to safeguard their profits. So and it's important to stress, I think, that we have seen a lot of initiatives coming up from people's movements and from trade unions, even leading to this ILO decision. And they have been campaigning pretty hard to switch this responsibility to the employers. And one of the recent examples, for example, was in Belgium, where the association Medics for the People, in their new plan of work, has included addressing the issues that workers in Belgium face when they become ill because of the jobs that they do. And so while at the moment they are often penalized if they fail to fill out some, kind of bureaucratic requirement by the government, they are penalized in financial ways, so they lose percentage of the money they get. On the other hand, employers are not required to do anything at all. So basically, if a worker falls ill because of the job that they are working in, the employer can simply say that they do not have an adequate substitution for this kind of workplace, and are allowed to basically to kick the worker out. So Medics for the People and other organizations are asking for this, for basically the blame to be shifted, and to essentially require employers that, first of all, to ensure that their workplaces are quite, healthy and safe as much as possible, and then, of course, also to step up and bear the responsibility if they cause someone to fall ill. So essentially, the ILO decision is, of course, a step in the right direction, but it still very much depends on what the governments choose to do at home.
Anna, thanks so much for that update. and we'll have you back hopefully very soon on Daily Debrief. But for this episode, that does it from us, Anna, myself, and the entire People's Dispatch team. Thank you very much for watching this episode of the show. For more details on all of these stories, you can, of course, as always, head over to our website, peoplesdispatch.org, and also give us a follow on whatever social media platform you use for updates on the work we do. Thank you for watching. We'll see you tomorrow. Goodbye.